Can you see them?
Yes.
Great. So I apologize in advance for being the one who will probably eat up your coffee break, or at least prolong, shift it a bit. My talk closely aligns with actually with Nina Nørgaard's keynote yesterday, but it takes a somewhat different and I think complementing path. I am going to present an approach to writing and script, which is informed by an interpretive and metapragmatic social linguistic approach to communication. And this approach conceives of communication as a designed performance, that is, as an act whose interpretation relies on the form in which it's being enacted and the assumptions, expectations, and evaluations this very form and formedness is subjected to in the social community within which communication takes place. Design is thereby construed not so much as a roughly intentional and strategic way of shaping things, but as a socially meaningful formedness. In metapragmatic terms, designs are socially enregistered forms of communication, that is, forms or social emblems in metapragmatic terms that are indexically linked with specific experiences and expectations as to which context they are usually used in, which actors usually use them, and which practices they are usually part of. Metapragmatic theory has it that all forms of communication, lexic, varieties, etc., are to different degrees socially enregistered in this sense and are therefore interpreted as signs for contexts of interpretation or contextualization cues in John Gompert's terms. The reading and interpretation of such cues, however, relies on what interpretive and social linguistics calls communicative knowledge, on socially distributed and learned assumptions on what something means. And this knowledge is triggered by the cues and is the central base of understanding or meaning making in interaction. In Roman Jakobson's terms, design centrally fuels the so-called poetic function of communication, one and the central one, in fact, of Jakobson's 6 basic communicative functions. In his seminal paper on linguistics and poetics, Jakobson pointed out that any form of linguistic that neglects poetics illicitly restricts itself, as it does not account for the power of the most central feature of any natural language, namely variation. This resonates with the basic social linguistic axiom that linguistic variation is what makes language the powerful societal tool it is. Now, if we conceive of design as a socially enregistered form, part of contextualization, an index and trigger of knowledge, and as a poetic device in Jakobson's sense, we basically follow a practice-based approach to communication, which conceives of communication and communication design as a social practice. This is the perspective I want to unfold, and I hope to make it tempting to you in what follows. Of course, given the topic of this conference, I restrict myself to one mode of communication, writing, and the most obvious, but of course not the only, but of course only one of its many forms of designedness, namely typography. So how is typography, or more sociolinguistically put, typographic variation, a social practice in these terms? Let me approach this question slowly and first elaborate in a bit more detail the core concepts I draw on. And I begin with the central one, namely social practice. Social practice is a social scientific concept, and my own approach mainly derives from the sociology of knowledge, and here you'll find some seminal references. The term denotes a typified act or performance which is bound to social or cultural contexts. Social practices, thus, are acts that draw on social presuppositions, routines, and evaluations, or on cultural knowledge, as we might term it. They are attributed specific social value in specific social contexts. Specifically, social practices include acts that are construed in such contexts by specific actors as being common, typical, normal, or at least to be expected. The case in point is the joint raising of glasses at a specific phase of a coordinated consumption at the occasion of a dinner. Social practices are institutionalized, that is, they are habituated through iteration and incorporated in form of bodily routines and dispositions. This is Bourdieu's habitus. Therefore, they are usually performed and interpreted routinely and only reflected in the case of distortions. For instance, if a person at the dinner starts eating and drinking before the glasses have been raised, or when cultural novices are inaugurated into a practice. In such cases, they say, that's how we do it. This is how one does it. Or in the case of distortion, we just don't do it like that, or that's not appropriate. As stressed, social practices are bound to contexts. While eating at a fast food restaurant, you would probably cause irritation. Would you reprimand your companions for not raising their soft drinks before starting the meal? But you might also cause laughter and ironic apology and indeed cup raising. But this is yet another phenomenon we need to talk about later, namely recontextualization. Social practices ease navigation within our life worlds as they provide typified solutions to recurring problems and allow us to make sense of other people's and in fact also of our own behavior. Since interactional social linguistics has it that communicative practices do not only reflect but actively constitute, meaning the joint raising of glasses co-creates the collective construal of the dinner event, social practices are conceived of as acts which construct meaning. As Bongard summarizes, in social practices, social orders are produced, reproduced, and transformed on the basis of implicit knowledge. The implicit knowledge equips actors with creativity potentials, shared skills, and shared symbol systems, which allow for practical understandings. Implicit knowledge is neither intentional action nor a mechanic following of rules. It is conceived as incorporated and embodied. End of quote. Communicative social practices are thus situated between what has been called in the classic structuralist binarism system and use. They are neither completely occasional and ephemeral, nor completely abstract and context devoid. In structuralist terms, we could situate them at the level which has been called the norm, or le usage, as opposed to la langue and la parole by Eugenio Coserio. The subset of the systemic possible, which is conceived as normal by a given collective. Social practices are intersubjectively regular, but they are bound to specific context of use, not only, as we shall see, in that they presuppose them, but also in that they co-constitute them. They consist of actions that connect to previous actions recurrently and iteratively, and thus form part of a semiotic chain, as Asif Aga has termed it, the tradition and social meaning which they ensue by practicing. In this sense, the raising of glasses today at this dinner connects to all previous glass raisings at the occasion of dinners. And through these connections, any act recontextualizes those previous actions and their connection. Social practices, hence, are acts of recreation, Akte der Wiederschöpfung, as Coserio so nicely phrased it. Any communicative practice, in other words, always has a historical dimension to it. Communication is always historical. Social practices thereby closely connect to a third dimension, which is also to be located between system and use, the realm of values and attitudes, or as I call it in social linguistic terms, the realm of ideologies of communication. Ideologies of communication comprise any sets of beliefs about the value, meaning, and the conditions of use, typical contexts and persons that are attributed to specific forms of communication. They include language ideologies, but also, among others, ideologies concerning the value and meaning of particular media. It's called media ideologies. And what is of particular concern for us today, beliefs about the value, meaning, sense, function, and typical usage circumstances of typographic design, which I call graphic ideologies. Following Michael Silverstein, I assume that system use and ideology are always interrelate with each other, which is why an analysis of language and communication, what Silverstein calls the total linguistic fact, needs to consider all these three dimensions and their interrelation. In other words, any social practice sits at the intersection of what the system or structure allows for, what is actually being uttered, the use in Coserio's speech, and the ideological descriptions attached to particular forms in use, Coserio's norm. And design, I argue, connects these three strata. Therefore, graphic design and writing practice is always graphically designed, needs to be construed at this intersection. With regard to typography, this means that it is too short-sighted to regard it as a semiotic resource, or merely as a semiotic resource, or meaning potential, as many accounts propose. Of course, that's part of it, and I'll elaborate on that in a moment. But foregrounding that alone risks to overshadow the pragmatic and ideological dimensions for the sake of the systemic. That's, in Jakobson's word, an illicit restriction. From a practice perspective, what we need to include in the analysis is how such systemic potentials are enacted in context, that is used and interpreted by enacted in context, used and interpreted in communication rather routinely by specific actors in their respective life worlds. And this process is framed by ideology. So I just lost the slides. I'm back here, right? Since typography, as any other communicative form, is nothing that is meaningful per se, but something that is made meaningful by specific social actors in specific contextual and communicative configurations on the basis of communicative knowledge that is in and through social practices. Let's go now to typography a bit more in detail. On the systemic layer, forms of communication, including typographic forms, are potentially functional precisely because they are variable. This is the case already for referential meaning. The possibility to referentially differentiate the German word Tisch from fish, for instance, depends on the formal graphemic variability of letters, here T versus phi, F, which, as Goodman pointed out, are interpreted by respectively socialized readers and writers in systematically disjunctive, that is, categorizable form as a differentiator in denotational terms. This even works, respective contextual knowledge, given if systemic positions are swapped or omitted strategically or erroneously, or if formal features are indifferent. This is Karl Bühler's principle of apperceptive complement. Evidently, however, not every variant is referentially distinctive. This applies to graphic variation to the same degree than to phonetic variation. And this certainly does not mean that variation is not meaningful in such cases. As you know, a base assumption of social linguistics is that non-referentially distinctive variation, alternative ways of saying the same thing, as Leboeuf famously phrased it, is what communicates social meaning. Communicative variation, thus, is multifunctional, with a referential function just being one of several functions bound to variation. And as Karl Bühler, the great theorist of linguistic polyfunctionality, reminded us, it is particularly the non-referentially distinctive variants that are suited for other communicative functions, according to Bühler's principle of abstractive relevance. Simply put, since fish already indicates a referential difference vis-à-vis Tisch, variation of T and F is not suitable for sociolinguistic differentiation. Compare this with typographic variation, which is not referentially distinctive, but also with non-referentially distinctive graphetic variants within and without the orthographic spectrum, such as these examples from German respellings. Precisely because they are not relevant for referential purposes, Bühler argues variants of this kind are free for other functions such as expression or appeal. Whether sociolinguistic differentiation takes place or not, however, is not decided on the systemic level. The system only provides possibilities for variation. If and how these possibilities are employed and functionalized is not a systemic question, but a question that concerns the social practice. Relevant is what is taken to be common in a given social context. And this is subject to social and situational variation. Variable in this context is not only which systemic possibilities are used at all, for instance, microtypographic variations such as ligatures, font protrusion, and kerning harmonization, which is used primarily in the context of professional print and by actors who want to have the publications looking professional. Strategic distortion of such typographic principles, primarily in the context of avant-garde and reflexive typography, in the tradition of Neville Brody and what you see here, David Carson. Heterographic respellings, such as punks, primarily in the writing of specific communities of practice, in texts that seek to address such writers, or that attempt to construct a particular context and reach a specific audience. Not only the use, also the interpretation of such variants differs socially and situatively. Not all variants are perceived as being meaningful by all recipients, and depending on the context, they might be interpreted differently. Consider black letter type on beer labels, gangster rap covers, and political posters. Even more, some variants are not perceived as variants at all by some recipients and are thus not available to interpretation. Dissolved ligatures at morpheme boundaries, highly meaningful to typophiles, are a case in point. While others are particularly salient and even serve as shibboleths in specific practices. Consider black letter type as a graphic stereotype of right-wing propaganda, or the trimata as a genre cue in some historical heavy metal subgenres. In other words, variants are perceivable and interpretable to different degrees, and this depends on the social practice as well. Perception and interpretation in the context of social practices are done, as already mentioned, usually rather routinely than explicitly. They are explicit in the case of intentional or unintentional distortion. Practice-conforming typography is therefore just as practice-conforming verbal action, not only meaningful if actors explicitly and consciously take note of it and reflect it. On the contrary, we can assume, for instance, following Althusser, that the contextualizing effect of communicative forms is the stronger, the more natural and obvious the form appears to be. This resonates with what Frank Rausch, a German interface designer, proposes in a recently published master's thesis on readability in digital media. Rausch conceives of transparency as not being a quality that is inherent to the form alone, but that depends on expectations and experiences within particular genres. By the same token, interpretations do not need to assume intentionality, particularly in the case of indexical inferences. Interpreters even need to assume non-intentionality to make sense. For instance, if they deduce from a given variant incompetence or sloppiness on part of the producer. All such inferences draw on context-specific knowledge and on ascriptions. Social practice, in other words, depends on communicative knowledge, in our case, graphic knowledge, and ideologies of communication, in our case, graphic ideologies. The practice approach assumes that communication always leaves space for interpretation, space which is filled with meaning by recipients drawing on their communicative knowledge. Based on this knowledge, recipients draw hypotheses about what is going on and how a given communicative utterance does make sense. Interpreters thereby draw on what, to put it with Goffman, interlocutors give and what they give off. The knowledge they employ is a sort of practical knowledge which is acquired by social actors over the course of the socialization and which is linked with social practices. It is not necessarily open to reflection and articulation, but it is available to the actors in specific situations, and it usually seems natural, or as Schütz-Luckmann put it, unproblematic until further notice. The cues that are subject to this interpretation process are what interactional social linguistic terms contextualization cues. Contextualization cues are indexicals, that is, signs that are interpreted as being linked with specific context and thus help constituting this context as a frame of interpretation. They indicate how a communicative process is to be construed. Graphic features, I assume, are communicatively relevant primarily as contextualization cues. They might, among others, provide hints concerning the categorization of text elements, semantic markup, concerning the genres, what I call genre cues, concerning the historical localization of the text, historicity cues, and concerning the involved actors, their social background, positions, and values, register cues. But they only do this for actors who have learned to read the cues in a given context in a given way, that is, actors drawing on a particular communicative, or for that matter, graphic knowledge. This is the reason why text design is interpreted differently and in different intensity and explicitness by different actors. And this is the reason why there isn't, from my perspective, a global grammar of visual design, as social semiotics proposes, but rather a range of different social practices of visual design. These practices, however, are not individual, but social and socially distributed. Communicative forms are subject to social scription. They are, as mathematic theory has it, socially enregistered. Enregistered also means that they are linked with expectations, values, and attitudes. These expectations, values, and attitudes are called ideologies of communication. And these ideologies allow us to construe graphic variants as contextualization cues. They are the fundamental link between system use and social practice. Next thing I will skip a bit due to time is the issue of recontextualization. Sometimes things get recontextualized in other forms and they import, this is what we heard yesterday, the connotation aspect in Van Leeuwen's terminology, knowledge and map it onto different contexts. We can see this in the case of these graphic recontextualizations of the Last Supper. And if we look at typography, we can also see that recontextualization can take place with regard to genres. Here is a mock obituary with regard to historicity. This is emulated historicity with regard to graphic shibboleths, so including foreign voices. Interpretation of these recontextualizations requires practical knowledge concerning multiple practices, the ones which graphic means are adopted from and the ones to which they are adopted. And this also requires some sort of knowledge. So I come to my conclusions. I see that my 20 minutes are up, but just a few sentences. Typographic design, I have argued, is a socially enregistered form, part of contextualization and recontextualization, an index and trigger of knowledge, a poetic device that employs the social functions of graphic variation, and ultimately a social practice that is deeply embedded in our life worlds. If we follow this path towards polyfunctionality, also in the written mode of communication, I argue we will get closer to the understanding of the full power of writing and reading in society and to writing practice in the 21st century. Incidentally, after I finished this last slide, you see here, it suddenly occurred to me that the macro typographic configuration you see here resembles a cocktail glass. This was not my intention, but maybe it's not meaningless either. So cheers all, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Jürgen. It resembles a cocktail glass, but also the Holy Grail.
Right. This is sort of my Holy Grail.
Any question from the audience? Any question online? Cornelia, is this a question?
No, it's just a cocktail glass.
Ah, okay.
Thank you for that.
Wrong emoji. Okay, so no questions. Thank you very much, Jürgen.
Thank you. Enjoy your coffee, and we'll see you later.